This is a graveyard, where the bones of an unknown number of vessels lie buried under this reclaimed land, an earthen wharf under the Dartmouth side of the Angus MacDonald Bridge in Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia. There are a few treasures to be found here, but the most interesting is an old 1911 trawler, literally entombed on the edge of this land, the waves lapping over her decks with each rising tide.
So this would have been the deck house, and you would have been able to go through here and out onto the deck.
But this isn't a simple tugboat cast aside and forgotten. This hulk is the wreck of the 113-year-old SS Daisy, which saw action in raids during the First World War, caught smugglers during Prohibition, and even survived a deadly tsunami before being buried here and mostly forgotten. We're exploring the J.P. Porter Marine Base and going below deck of what little remains of the SS Daisy, here on Part-Time Explorer. The Halifax Harbor sees all sorts of marine traffic, from cargo ships and tankers to large cruise ships, to a reliable, more than 270-year-old ferry service between Halifax and Dartmouth on the other side of the water. But in a forgotten corner, beneath the bridge and across some railroad tracks, lies an old scrapyard. Not much happens here, and today the site is a homeless camp, but we're slipping in for a quick survey of a wreck that deserves to be remembered, the SS Daisy. Construction on the Daisy began around 1910 or 1911 at the John Duthie Tory Shipbuilding Company in Aberdeen, Scotland. It's said that she was initially intended to be a fishing trawler, but while she was still on the stocks and under construction, the British Royal Navy purchased her, along with her sister, the Esther. From then on, her designs were modified to better fit the various special purposes that the Admiralty had in mind for her, which included minesweeping and survey work. Now, the SS Daisy was officially the HMS Daisy. Both Daisy and her sister had a displacement of around 500 to 600 tons and measured 125 feet in length, or about 38 meters. In late 1911, Daisy's single engine, which drove a single screw, or propeller, was installed. The engine had 3 cylinders, the tops of which are still visible, standing up ever so slightly higher than the rock fill that was poured into the ship. If we were able to clear away the rocks, the engine would probably be standing around 6 or 7 feet tall. The Daisy had between 500 and 600 horsepower, depending on the source, which gave the Daisy a top speed of around 10 knots. She wasn't fast, but she was built strong and perfect for utilitarian work behind the lines. Daisy was launched in 1911 and completed on February 2nd, 1912, then being delivered to the Admiralty. Her first assignment was in April 1912, surveying sections of the River Humber, northern England, with the Esther joining the project in August. In May of 1912, Daisy was out of commission briefly, only a month into her first job. As she was sitting at anchor, she was struck by the HMS St. George. With the outbreak of the First World War, the Admiralty fitted the ship out as a minesweeper, and Daisy was put to use with various services, most often surveying as usual, but the war brought her into the action, or at least close to the action, on several occasions. Being a part of the Nore Command, she was purportedly involved as a support vessel during the Zeebrugge raid of April 1918, as well as the raids on Ostend. The First World War was an era of rapid progress in ship design, and a trawler that was built 2 years before the war was considered too antiquated for the Royal Navy by the end of the war, only 4 years later. And so, the 6-year-old HMS Daisy was set aside and placed in reserve. A year and a half goes by, and the Daisy is pulled out of reserve and sold to the government of Newfoundland. Now today, Newfoundland is a Canadian province, but in 1912 it was its own dominion under the British Empire. That being said, in 1917 Newfoundland followed the lead of several nearby Canadian provinces and instituted Prohibition, banning most alcoholic beverages, anything over 2% alcohol content. Newfoundland was, as it is today, scattered with countless remote fishing villages all along its coast. In order to enforce this ban, the government, specifically the Ministry of Finance and Customs, needed small vessels to patrol the lengthy coastline and prevent the illegal import of liquor. The Daisy became a revenue cutter and was stationed in the Newfoundland town of Burin for that very purpose. Even after Prohibition ended in Newfoundland in 1924, the Ministry of Finance continued using the Daisy for some time. And then 5 years later, Daisy was involved in what was probably its most dramatic story. November 18th, 1929, the Daisy was tied to its wharf in Burin when a massive earthquake struck the Grand Banks, rocking Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, and was felt as far away as Philadelphia in the United States. The quake caused minor damage, but what followed was disastrous. This was a rural area where earthquakes were rare, and most people around didn't know the dangers of a coastal earthquake. 2.5 hours later, as evening fell, Daisy's officers and their friends were on board playing cards when the ship was lifted by a surging tidal wave, lifting the vessel up onto the wharf. The crew rushed out onto the deck, perhaps through this very gangway, to see the town of Burin being swept away. This whole area of Newfoundland was struck by the wave, with 28 lives lost. However, it was in the aftermath that the Daisy truly shined. Now, as the water was receding, Daisy was taken off of the wharf by the wave and placed gently back in the water undamaged. Several houses and unmanned boats were dragged out to sea with the receding waters, and there are reports of Daisy and other vessels, such as this schooner, going out and towing them back in, saving several lives and lots of property. After the wave hit, Burin was cut off from the rest of the world, as all telegraph lines had been severed. However, the Daisy was one of the few ships in the area that actually had a wireless telegraph on board and was therefore capable of sending out a distress call on behalf of the community and reporting local damages. However, the crew ended up never touching the telegraph because none of them knew how to use it, so the Daisy ended up steaming the 200 miles into St. John's to report the damage in person. Daisy was eventually reassigned by the Newfoundland government. Now, as I mentioned, most of the communities along the Newfoundland coast were remote and rural, and few of them had roads connecting them, and if they did have roads, they were inconvenient to travel. So Daisy's new job was to transport government officials such as agents and clerks and lawyers and police and sheriffs and anyone like that to these different communities by sea. Daisy continued this role until 1945, when Newfoundland sold her off completely. The new buyer was J.P. Porter, who brought the ship here to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The J.P. Porter Company was a dredging and marine construction company founded in 1921 and registered in Montreal. But this site in Dartmouth seemed to be their main center of operations. They did jobs all along the east coast of Canada, and even some work as far south as Boston. In 1949, when the Daisy was brought here, the Porter Wharf was a large L-shaped pier made of wood, with scattered buildings and cranes, and even a few vessels sitting up on the wharf out of the water. The company used the SS Daisy for 4 more years as a tugboat, until 1949, when the Dominion of Newfoundland was dissolved and became the Province of Newfoundland in Canada. Porter, who always seemed to do things on the cheap side, never updated the port of registry for the Daisy, and still had it registered in the now non-existent Dominion of Newfoundland. Still not bothering to update it, and probably hoping to avoid the import fee, the Daisy was set aside, Porter not legally being allowed to operate it. There is some indication that the Daisy was re-registered to Montreal in 1950, but little more was done with the ship after that anyway. In 1952, construction began on the Angus MacDonald Bridge, and the area around the J.P. Porter property was teeming with workers and equipment, and the Porter Yard may even have been used as a staging area for the project. The Porter Wharf needed to be expanded, so some of the vessels that were tied up there were surrounded by wooden pilings to keep them in place, sunk where they were, and then filled in with dirt and gravel. That was the fate of the SS Daisy. Daisy was sunk in 1953 or thereabouts. This image may be the last photograph taken of her before she was put into her final position. The Daisy here was then moved to the outside face of the wharf and sunk, and the wharf was filled in around it.
These are wood pilings here, and they would have been built around the ship once it was tied into place here and probably scuttled. And then the pilings would have been a pier on top, some sort of a framework so they could start filling in the land around it. So the wood actually kind of acted as a cage around the ship. You can see the steel and then the curvature of the stern back there. That's the boundary of the ship.
The newly expanded larger wharf, which was built on the backs of these sunken ships, was used for decades. But in the 1970s, the J.P. Porter Company was involved in a massive scandal, where they were caught rigging dredging contracts from the government, and were forced to sell off or scrap a lot of their equipment in order to pay off hefty fines. The J.P. Porter Wharf became a scrapyard, where it cannibalized its own vessels. Even the offices and outbuildings of the Porter Company were torn down, including this one that sat higher up from the main wharf by the foot of the bridge. The wharf adapted well to its new role as scrapyard and began accepting other vessels in the area to bring in and start scrapping even beyond the Porter fleet. Ships like this one were tied off to the wharf right by where the Daisy was sunk. The Daisy could still be seen peeking out from behind the pilings that have been built around it. One of the largest ships that was briefly brought to the wharf and tied up right to the Daisy was the 2,200-ton destroyer HMCS Saint Laurent, having been decommissioned and brought here for parts in 1979, before being sold to a firm in Texas for scrapping only a few months later. She sank off of North Carolina while being towed to the breakers. A walk around the old wharf site, which is also a homeless camp today, shows signs of the scrapyard that once was here, with riveted steel fragments and even recognizable pieces of vessels still scattered throughout the brush. Beneath this dirt are around half a dozen boats and small ships, but the Daisy is the most visible. After the scrapyard was abandoned in 1990, the water began eroding away at the ground that was filled in.
Boy, has she ever deteriorated. When I moved here in 1980, you couldn't even tell that that was a ship. All the wood was still there. And then when I got my first boat in 1987, I was going by here and I was looking carefully. And when I got up here, I thought, that looks like the bow of a boat, a ship, a tug or something. Like I say, it was completely solid, filled in, and all you could see was the sides of it. But now you can see a lot more. In fact, when I walked aboard it the first time, you know, I went inside. I went down and walked around inside. There was a roof above my head.
The wooden pilings around Daisy had vanished long ago, and now much of the vessel is exposed once more. So much so that she can be boarded once again, and we can take a small tour. Although the stern of the Daisy has rusted away down to little more than the framing, a portion of the steering mechanism is still in place.
The ground I'm standing on is probably about a foot to a foot and a half deep of dirt caked on top of the deck. We're out on the stern. This would have been a hatch.
Using an underwater camera, we can dip into some of the flooded compartments below. The harbor is murky, but seeing this is fascinating.
There's the tiller out there. That would have been right over the rudder.
I can't help but wonder what of the rudder still exists below the surface, although I'm certain that the propeller, likely made of brass, has long since been removed.
And this would have been a bulwark rail right here. So this would have been basically the gunwale of the ship, the railing. And then we would have come up to the deck house, yeah, with a handrail going along it right there. This is the lower hull down here. So this would have been the deck house, and you would have been able to go through here and out onto the deck. Going back in, we would be inside the ship. A wall right here, then another one right here. So these would have been separate rooms. And the deck house probably would have come out to here as well. So it really would have been this wide, and that's it. And then this would have been deck as well, and it would have been mirrored on the opposite side. You can see the riveting still on the deck plating.
Portions of the ship's wooden deck still remain on her starboard side and stern, while her port side remains buried in the wharf.
If you look at the underside of the wood, it was burned. So at some point, someone came in and burned the ship under it.
Today, while most of that infill that was poured into the ship has been eroded away, the engine room compartment is still filled to the brim, with only the tops of the engines visible, meaning that the bulkheads and hull around this part of the ship must still be relatively intact.
So here's something interesting. I just found this, which looks like a pipe, bending downward, and it's open right here. So there's a chance this is actually a really strong, heavy-duty railing, like a handrail, so that someone could go down to the deck below. So we have the engine space right here. Someone might have come through an opening right here. We can actually see the remains of the cut in the bulkhead for this opening. I could be wrong, that's very hard to tell. But they might have come through here, stepped down onto a catwalk, and started descending a ladder down to the keel, the lowest level of the ship, where they would have been able to work on this engine from below.
The forecastle would have been the chain locker and storeroom. It was common for crew to bunk way up forward, but I think this compartment is too small for that.
Going to take a quick look inside the forecastle. So that compartment right there is as far forward as we were able to get on the inside, but then there's another smaller compartment right here, and then the chain locker forward. And this compartment is actually two compartments side by side, plus a companionway is coming down the middle right here. So this would have been a compartment, this would have been a compartment over here, and judging by the shape of them, the position on the ship, these were probably bunk rooms. So two beds stacked up on top of each other, lining the hull, sort of like bunk beds.
Daisy didn't have a big crew. During the First World War, when her crew was probably the largest, she had a complement of around 14 people. But there were times in her Newfoundland service when she was reported to have only 3 crew.
Oh, that is all thorns. I'm not going to be pushing into this. But there we go, we're taking a look inside the chain locker right now. You can even see the hawse holes over there. 1 and 2. If you can see it through the thorn bush.
Stepping back off of the ship and onto the rocks, we can see that the bow section of the Daisy is still recognizable, with the hawse holes still in good shape where the anchors would have hung.
We got here just at low tide, so we're able to see as much of the ship as one can under normal circumstances.
The ship sinks all over again twice a day with each rising tide, the waves washing over her decks that saw so much history, from heated operations during the First World War to rescue and relief efforts after a rare Atlantic tsunami. My first visit to the Daisy was in 2017, when I took some photographs. Looking back on them and comparing them to now, the ship's rapid deterioration in the past 7 years is plainly evident. More of the deckhouse walls were standing back then. A larger portion of the steering gears were still mounted. A watertight door was still on its hinges on the forecastle. And in general, there simply was more of the ship back then. At this rate, there will be remains of the Daisy here for many years, but it won't be recognizable as a trawler for much longer. As of 2024, the Daisy, launched in 1911, is 113 years old, but after such a long journey, this wharf is the ship's final tomb. A huge thank you to Mac Mackay of the Shipfax blog for helping with research and allowing me to share his photographs. A link to his site can be found in the description below. Another thank you to my friend Scott Osmond, whose book Hidden Nova Scotia features the Daisy as well as several other treasures around the province. As you can see, I'm getting good use out of it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. Consider joining my YouTube channel memberships or Patreon at the link in the description below. As always, a special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankerts, Gabriel Colombe, RGB, Tara Mulikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Frazier, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy B, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, and The Peppermilk.